The Arabian Nights did not begin in the heart of Arabia, but in the firelit halls of Sassanid Persia, where master storytellers wove their tales not just for entertainment, but as a tool of power. In the royal courts of Persia, around the year 500 AD, under the reign of Khosrow I, stories were more than mere fiction. They were instruments of governance, shaping not just the destiny of kings, but the very fabric of empire. Sassanid Persia, the last great empire of pre-Islamic Persia, knew that the right story could transform the course of history. Every tale told in the royal palaces was crafted with precision, designed to preserve the empire's legacy and secure its future. The technique was simple, yet revolutionary. Never finish a story, for the promise of tomorrow's tale ensured the audience would return. Suspense became an art form, one that would transcend the walls of the Persian courts and echo through centuries. But as Arab conquerors swept through the lands, from Spain to the Hindu Kush, the ancient art of storytelling did not die. It was absorbed, transformed, and carried into the heart of Baghdad. Under the rule of Harun al-Rashid, Baghdad became the largest city in the world, a place where stories from Persia, India, Mesopotamia, and Greece merged into something greater. And in this new empire, amidst scholars and philosophers, a woman's voice would rise, a voice capable of altering the fate of a king. Shahrazad, the daughter of a vizier, would step into the royal bedchamber not as a wife, but as a storyteller, armed with nothing but the power of narrative. She would enter a space of unimaginable danger where death awaited at dawn. Yet, she would use the art of storytelling to reach deeper into the soul of King Shahryar, whose heart had been shattered by betrayal. Would her mastery of stories, the ancient wisdom passed down through generations, be enough to save her life? Or would it all fall apart with the dawn as the executioner's blade descended once again? Hey, if you're enjoying this incredible story and want to see more, don't just sit there. Subscribe now. You've made it this far, and you know you want to keep diving into the epic tales we have in store. Hit that subscribe button. It takes just a second, and it helps us keep bringing you the content you love. And while you're at it, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world. But if you haven't subscribed yet, please do us a favor. Let us know why in the comments. We genuinely want to hear your thoughts. What could we do to earn your subscription? We're all ears. Let's keep this conversation going. Your support means everything. Subscribe, comment, and let's keep the story alive. The origin of the Arabian Nights lies not in the distant sands of Arabia, but rather in the stone-hewn halls of the ancient Sassanid Empire, where the act of storytelling was far more than an art. It was the very fabric of statecraft itself. Around the 6th century AD, within the courts of the mighty rulers of Persia, stories were spun with a purpose as profound as they were captivating. The empire, which stretched from the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia to the rugged mountains of Central Asia, was not only defined by its military conquests and architectural grandeur, but by its intellectual wealth. At the center of this wealth was Khosrow I, a king whose reign marked a golden age of Persian civilization. Under his rule, the Sassanid Empire reached its peak, both in cultural and military prowess. Yet it was in the quiet corners of the palace, amidst the flickering light of oil lamps, where the true power of the empire was often felt most keenly. There, royal storytellers, men and women whose words could shape the very destiny of the empire, wove tales for an audience that included not only the nobility, but the very king himself.
But these stories were not the idle fables of children's books. They were strategic narratives, designed to reinforce the king's rule, shape public opinion, and even determine the fate of a kingdom. Each tale, whether it spoke of the great battles won by Persian kings or the moral lessons passed down from ancient sages, had a purpose far beyond mere entertainment. They were instruments of power, carefully crafted to guide, educate, and above all, persuade.
In the imperial courts of Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital, stories became intertwined with governance. The royal chroniclers, the keepers of the empire's history, spun the deeds of the king into legends. But unlike the cold annals of history, these tales were alive. They took on a shape of their own, growing in significance with each telling, weaving the ruler's image into the very fabric of the empire's identity. It was through these narratives that Khosrow I secured his place not just in the history of Persia, but in the hearts and minds of his people. The king, as much as he was a conqueror, was also a narrator, his rule a story told in the grandest terms. And yet, even amidst this great intellectual flourishing, the truth about the power of stories lay not in their ability to glorify, but in their ability to warn. For the stories told in these halls were moral tales. They were meant to reflect the very humanity of their subjects, whether noble or common, and in doing so, they became a mirror of the ruler's own soul. What made these stories so powerful was that they invited reflection, not only on the events of the world, but on the very nature of power, justice, and leadership. As Persian rulers sat in the majestic halls, bathed in the glow of the firelight, listening to tales that stirred their imaginations, the weight of those stories would come to bear on their decisions. The Sassanid court knew that how a king viewed loyalty, betrayal, mercy, and revenge could shape not only his reign, but the future of the empire itself. And yet, as the Sassanid Empire, once a beacon of cultural and political power, began to fracture under the weight of external invasions and internal turmoil, the art of storytelling faced a new, profound threat. Arab forces, sweeping in with an urgency and fervor that history would not soon forget, began to dismantle the empire from the inside out. The year 651 AD would mark the fall of the Sassanid dynasty, and with it, the collapse of a world that had, for centuries, shaped the destiny of Persia and beyond.
In this cataclysmic shift, the question arose, would the stories of this mighty empire, tales of gods and kings, of warriors and sages, survive the fall of its great walls? Would the ancient wisdom contained within these tales be lost to the sands of time, buried forever under the crushing weight of conquest and cultural erasure? Or would the legacy of these stories find new life in the deserts and palaces of the Arab caliphates, where the art of storytelling would flourish once more, adapting to the tides of time? And so, as the last remnants of the Sassanid Empire fell to the rising tide of the Arab conquests, the art of storytelling was not left to die quietly. Instead, it would evolve, fusing with the cultural traditions of India, Greece, and Arabia to form something altogether new. Yet, as the kingdom of Persia crumbled, so too did the certainty of its legacy. For as the world turned, as empires rose and fell, as religions spread and kingdoms shifted their borders, one thing remained clear. The power of storytelling was timeless, and it would continue to shape the world, whether under the banners of the Sassanids or the caliphates.
By the time the Abbasid Caliphate emerged in 750 AD, the city of Baghdad had become the largest, most prosperous city in the world. Under the rule of Harun al-Rashid, who reigned from 786 to 809 AD, the city became an intellectual and cultural beacon, drawing scholars, poets, and storytellers from all corners of the empire. The Abbasid revolution had swept away the Umayyad Caliphate, and with it, the very nature of what it meant to rule had begun to change. This was no longer simply an empire built on military might, but one rooted in knowledge, philosophy, and culture. It was in this fertile soil that the role of the storyteller began to evolve. No longer confined to the periphery of entertainment, storytellers in Baghdad became moral architects, cultural memory keepers, and in some ways, psychological healers for a society still coming to terms with its new identity. Where once stories had been told simply to entertain or to pass the time, they now served a higher, more profound purpose: to guide the moral compass of the empire, to preserve its intellectual heritage, and, perhaps most critically, to shape public perception at a time of political and social upheaval. In the bustling streets of Baghdad, intellectual salons and grand libraries flourished. The House of Wisdom, established under Harun al-Rashid, became a meeting place where scholars and translators from across the known world gathered to preserve the ancient texts of Greece, Persia, and India alongside the burgeoning works of Islamic thinkers. It was a place where the ideas of the past and the present collided, creating a cultural renaissance that would ripple across centuries. But amidst this intellectual flowering, it was the storytellers, sitting in the open courtyards, in the shadows of the city's great mosques, or in the quiet corners of Baghdad's royal court, who held the power to convey the deepest truths about human nature, justice, and the very essence of power.
The storyteller was a figure who spoke to the soul. Their narratives were not just entertainments, they were moral edicts woven into the fabric of everyday life. In the court of Harun al-Rashid, the king and his advisors were acutely aware of the importance of narrative in shaping not only the attitudes of their subjects, but the very foundation of their rule. They understood that through stories, the king's image could be both preserved and enhanced, his policies justified, and his decisions spiritually and emotionally validated. A ruler's authority could be reinforced or undermined by the stories told about him. Baghdad's storytellers were not merely chroniclers of events, they were the shapers of historical memory. They understood that history, in the eyes of the people, was not just what happened, it was how it was remembered. Thus, each story they told was a careful blend of fact and myth, of truth and legend, designed to plant seeds of wisdom that would grow into guiding principles for future generations. These stories didn't just reflect the world, they created the world in which the people lived. Whether tales of kings who fell from grace, merchants who triumphed through cunning, or sages whose wisdom changed the course of fate, the storytellers were the silent architects of society's values. And in these stories, the lines between truth and fiction often blurred. This was not deception, but an acknowledgement that the truths of power, the human condition, and the very nature of justice could not always be contained in simple historical facts. Instead, they were woven into layers of meaning, hidden beneath allegories and metaphors, awaiting the listener's intellect to unravel them. For the storyteller was not just a conveyor of information, but a master of moral persuasion, carefully navigating the complex terrain of ethics, loyalty, and betrayal that defined the age. In the private quarters of the royal palace, where Harun al-Rashid and his closest advisors sat, the storyteller's role was as vital as any general, as important as any vizier. They were entrusted with the most delicate of tasks, not only to entertain, but to shape the thoughts and actions of the empire's most powerful figures. In the tense atmosphere of the court, where decisions were made that could alter the fate of the empire, the storyteller's words could serve as both shield and sword, offering wisdom when needed, but also holding up the mirror to the empire's deepest fears and desires.
The storyteller's art reached beyond the walls of the royal court, though. They ventured into the streets, into the very heart of Baghdad's vibrant marketplaces, where their stories became part of the daily rhythm of life. Whether performed for the common folk in a bustling square or shared in intimate gatherings at the edge of the Tigris River, their tales served as constant reminders of the values upon which the empire stood. Stories of the Prophet Muhammad, of Ali and the righteous caliphs, of justice, charity, and faith circulated alongside those of ancient Persian kings and Hindu deities, each reflecting a complex worldview that spanned continents and centuries. Yet, as Baghdad grew in intellectual and cultural stature, so too did the weight of its imperial responsibilities. As the Abbasid Caliphate faced external threats from the rising powers of the Byzantine Empire and the Turkish invasions to internal strife and revolts, the role of the storyteller became ever more significant. With the ebb and flow of political tides, the stories that had once celebrated imperial glory began to question the morality of unchecked power, corruption, and the fragility of human ambition. Through Shahrazad's tales, these very themes would take center stage. The storyteller's voice, once a symbol of political reinforcement, would now become a tool for transformation, challenging the foundations of the king's authority. For as Harun al-Rashid's empire faced its own internal fractures, so too did the power of storytelling face a profound test. Could it evolve from a means of political consolidation to a force of moral reckoning? Would the art of storytelling remain a tool of the elite, or could it become a voice for the oppressed and forgotten? As Shahrazad, the daughter of a vizier, stepped into the royal bedchamber to face King Shahryar, could a single woman, armed only with her voice, ever hope to challenge the king's deeply entrenched beliefs on justice, loyalty, and betrayal? Could the ancient art of storytelling transform not only the heart of the king, but the very nature of the empire itself?
In the heart of 8th century Baghdad, a city that had risen from the dust of the Arabian deserts to become the greatest intellectual center of the known world, stood the House of Wisdom, a beacon of knowledge and curiosity. Its walls echoed not just with the quiet murmur of scholars and scribes, but with the cross-pollination of ideas from Greece, Persia, India, and Mesopotamia. Under the reign of Harun al-Rashid, who ascended to the caliphate in 786 AD, Baghdad became the focal point of a cultural renaissance, drawing thinkers from across the vast expanse of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city was no longer just the capital of a growing empire, it had become the intellectual heart of the world, where the minds of East and West, of antiquity and the present, intersected and merged. The House of Wisdom was far more than just a library or a gathering place for scholars. It was a crucible of knowledge, where Greek philosophical texts, works of Plato and Aristotle, the scientific treatises of Hippocrates and Galileo, and the mystical works of Plotinus were translated into Arabic. These texts, once confined to the West, now found a new home in the heart of the Islamic world. But it wasn't just the intellectual legacy of ancient Greece that was being brought into the fold. Persian epics, the fables of India, and Mesopotamian myths, all of which had once been buried beneath the weight of empires lost to time, came alive again in Baghdad, each weaving into the tapestry of the city's cultural renaissance. This intellectual amalgamation, this synthesis of ancient wisdom, was not merely the product of curiosity or scholarly ambition. It was a deliberate effort by the Abbasid caliphs to unite and unify the vast and diverse cultures under their rule. Baghdad was not only a city of conquerors, but a city of learners, where the understanding of the world was expanded through the study of different cultures and philosophies. It was here that the greatest minds of the age gathered not only to preserve knowledge, but to synthesize it, to reinterpret and reimagine ideas from various traditions into something uniquely Arab-Islamic. The role of storytelling in this cultural fusion was profound. In earlier times, stories served merely as entertainment or a means of recording history. But in 8th century Baghdad, storytelling became something far more powerful. It became an instrument of education, a way to transmit philosophical thought, ethical teachings, and social norms to a public that was increasingly diverse and intellectually engaged.
In the vibrant markets of Baghdad, in the majestic courts of the caliphs, and in the study halls of the House of Wisdom, the storyteller had become a custodian of wisdom. Each tale told, whether of Persian kings, Greek philosophers, or Indian sages, was a living, breathing metaphor for the values and principles that guided the empire. These stories were not simply passed from one generation to the next. They were crafted, molded, and refined by the storytellers themselves, who were keenly aware of the power they held in shaping both minds and society. They used stories to reinforce social norms, to teach virtue, and to weave together the moral fabric of the growing empire. Baghdad was a cosmopolitan melting pot, a place where cultures and ideas were intertwined. In this environment, storytelling was not a passive practice, but a dynamic force. The fables that emerged in the streets and salons of Baghdad often carried profound moral lessons, reflecting the complexities of human nature and the nuances of power, justice, and loyalty. These tales, whether about kings or commoners, served to remind the people of the ever-present tension between good and evil, between power and humility, between justice and revenge. The moral conflicts woven into these stories often mirrored the real political struggles faced by the caliphs themselves. As Baghdad continued to expand its influence and intellectual reach, the stories coming out of the city began to bridge the gap between East and West. Arabic translations of Greek, Persian, and Indian works began to influence Western thought in ways that would echo for centuries, impacting everything from medieval philosophy to the Renaissance. The great works of Aristotle and Hippocrates, once lost to the Western world, now found their way into the hands of European scholars, who would later build upon them. Meanwhile, the Persian epics of Shahnameh and the Indian fables of Panchatantra began to shape the way people in the West thought about morality, leadership, and courage. Yet, as the empire grew in power and its influence spread, uncertainty loomed. The caliphate's rapid expansion brought with it internal tensions, as various factions, both within the empire and without, vied for control. The stories that had flourished in Baghdad, those that had once united the people and educated the masses, began to face a different kind of test. Could they endure the changing tides of time and power? Would the stories of this great city continue to bridge the divide between East and West? Or would they, like so many other empires, become lost to history, their wisdom buried beneath the weight of political upheaval and conquest? As the empire's influence spread, would these newly forged stories bridge the gap between East and West? Or would the empire's rise lead to the eventual death of these tales, buried beneath the weight of time and conquest? When Shahrazad stepped into the royal chamber of King Shahryar, she was no mere victim awaiting the inevitable stroke of the executioner's sword. She was a woman of intellect, poised with a quiet strength that belied the tremors in her heart. She knew well that her fate rested not in the sharpness of her tongue, but in the depths of her storytelling. Armed with the ancient wisdom of Persian epics, Indian fables, and the profound psychological understanding gleaned from her father's teachings, Shahrazad was prepared to engage in a battle not of swords, but of words. Shahrazad's mission was not simply to survive the king's wrath. She sought to transform him. The stories she chose were more than just tales of kings and gods. They were intricate, deliberate creations, each carefully crafted to challenge the king's understanding of justice, mercy, and revenge. In a world governed by absolute power and retribution, where betrayal had torn the very fabric of trust, Shahrazad saw an opportunity not just to save her life, but to heal a broken soul. Each night, as the moonlight bathed the chamber in its soft glow, Shahrazad began her tale. She spoke in the rhythm of a seasoned storyteller, letting her words slip from her lips like silk threads, each one weaving a narrative web around the king's heart. But these stories were not mere distractions. They were designed to reach deep into the recesses of Shahryar's psyche, to unearth his darkest fears, his bitter regrets, and his sorrowful loss.
The stories Shahrazad told were drawn from the moral landscapes of ancient Persia, India, and Mesopotamia, worlds filled with timeless parables about betrayal, loyalty, and redemption. But Shahrazad, keenly aware of the emotional landscape she was navigating, did not simply recount these tales for entertainment. She tailored them with a singular purpose in mind: to disrupt the king's entrenched beliefs about the nature of power and justice. These were not just stories of kingdoms lost or regained, but mirrors held up to the king's own heart, urging him to see the consequences of vengeance and the possibility of forgiveness. In her tale of the merchant and the jinni, Shahrazad spoke of a merchant who, after being wronged by the very forces he trusted, found himself in a position to take vengeance. Yet in a moment of profound moral clarity, the merchant chose mercy, not just for his enemies, but for his own soul. This, Shahrazad knew, was the crux of her strategy: to teach the king that mercy could be more powerful than vengeance, that forgiveness could heal the wounds of betrayal rather than further deepen them. As Shahrazad spun her stories, the king, captivated by the plot's unfolding, found himself drawn deeper into the narrative. But these were not stories that would allow him to sit as a passive observer. Each tale subtly challenged his assumptions, shifted his perceptions, and asked him to question the very core of his heart. Could it be that justice did not always require retribution? Was it possible that a ruler could rule not through the fear of punishment, but through the wisdom of mercy? The stories she told were woven with psychological insight, drawing on Shahryar's own experience with betrayal. For Shahrazad understood that to reach the king, she could not merely speak of loyalty and trust. She needed to acknowledge the depth of his grief. She needed him to understand that his pain was not just a reflection of betrayal, but also of his inability to heal from it. Healing, she suggested, lay not in the destruction of those who had wronged him, but in redemption. A redemption that, like the characters in her stories, might lead him to a higher understanding of himself and his rule. Her stories also contained subtle reflections of his own darkness, acknowledging the emotions he tried to bury beneath his vengeful rage. Shahrazad understood the intricacies of the king's inner turmoil better than anyone. He, too, had been betrayed by someone he trusted, someone he loved, and the sharpness of that wound had festered, turning to rage and mistrust. But Shahrazad's tales, gently woven with compassion, held out the possibility of a different path, a path where forgiveness became an act of strength, not weakness, and where mercy was an expression of true power. As the days passed into nights, Shahrazad's strategy began to take root. The king, whose heart had once been hardened by the pain of betrayal, began to look at the world and at the women in his life with new eyes. Each tale had softened his stance, ever so slightly, revealing the cracks in his armor of cruelty and injustice. But while Shahrazad had won the king's attention, she knew her mission was far from complete. She was not just telling stories, she was reshaping a man's worldview, helping him to see that his sense of justice could be rooted not in punishment, but in understanding. Every night she told a new story, each one carefully chosen, each one slowly unraveling the tightly wound knots of hatred and pain that had bound the king's heart for years. But the question remained: would Shahrazad's stories be enough to change the king? Could her psychological mastery and narrative ingenuity ultimately heal him? Or would the ghosts of his past, those haunting shadows of betrayal, consume them both? But with each passing night, as Shahrazad wove tales of betrayal, loyalty, and justice, could her strategy work? Would the king remain captivated, or would his vengeance consume her before the dawn? For 3 long years, King Shahryar had lived in the shadows of his grief, a grief so deep and consuming that it had become the very foundation of his reign. The betrayal of his first wife had shattered him, not just emotionally, but philosophically. Shahryar's worldview, once rooted in the principles of justice and loyalty, had been torn asunder by the perceived treachery of the one person he had trusted above all others. His response was not just one of anger, but of existential despair. And from that despair, he constructed a brutal logic. If a woman could betray the trust of her husband, the king, then all women must surely be treacherous by nature. His heart had become a fortress of distrust, and with each passing day, his belief that vengeance was the only path to justice grew stronger. In his eyes, betrayal could only be met with one punishment: death. His reasoning, though ruthless, was not born of cruelty alone. It was born of a deep wound that had never healed, a wound that made him see the world through a lens of betrayal and punishment. Every woman he encountered was a reminder of his lost trust, and in response, he enacted his brutal decree. The cycle was relentless. Betrayal led to punishment, and the punishment was death. It was a logic that both protected him from further heartbreak and isolated him from the very thing he once desired most: love. But then came Shahrazad. Shahrazad was not just a woman to be executed like so many before her. She was different, a puzzle to be solved, a mystery wrapped in the form of a storyteller. When she entered the king's chamber, she brought with her not just her beauty and intelligence, but an entire world of stories, each one carefully chosen to pierce the impenetrable walls of his heart. She was no mere entertainer. She was a strategist, a woman who knew the power of narrative and psychology, a woman who understood that the key to the king's soul lay not in force, but in the power of story to reframe reality. Shahrazad's approach was a careful dance of words and wisdom. She did not rush to confront the king's beliefs or challenge his sense of justice directly. Instead, she began her narrative journey in the softest of ways, using stories not just to entertain, but to offer him a mirror in which he could see his own pain. The first stories she told, often filled with allegory and paradox, were designed to introduce subtle lessons about the human condition. Through these stories, she made him confront not just the consequences of betrayal, but also the human fragility that gave rise to it. One such tale was that of the merchant and the genie, a story that, at first glance, seemed to be about a simple transaction gone wrong. But as the king listened, Shahrazad slowly steered the tale into a discussion about the nature of justice. Was it truly just to seek vengeance when one had been wronged? Or was the path of mercy perhaps a higher form of justice? The merchant, wronged by a genie who had killed his beloved, initially sought revenge, but as the tale unfolded, the king saw the merchant's eventual choice to forgive, to rise above the thirst for retribution, not as a weakness, but as a strength of character, one that healed wounds rather than deepened them. With each night, Shahrazad's stories peeled back the layers of the king's heart. Her stories, rich with moral complexity, did not merely entertain, they forced him to face the nature of his own grief, to recognize the depth of his sorrow, and in doing so, they began to chip away at the rigid beliefs that had kept him prisoner to his anger and pain. Shahrazad's stories spoke of forgiveness, of mercy over retribution, of love's ability to redeem even the darkest of souls. Each tale became a thread, and with each passing night, that thread wove a tapestry of redemption in the king's mind, one that was as intricate and fragile as the king's own sense of justice.
Yet Shahrazad's task was not an easy one. The king's heart had been hardened by years of trauma, and though he was deeply moved by her stories, he could not yet abandon the vengeful impulse that had sustained him for so long. The psychological barrier between him and Mercy was formidable, and the king's inner conflict began to take shape. Was justice truly the same as vengeance, or was there room for another kind of justice, a mercy that would break the endless cycle of pain?
In her stories, Shahrazad did not simply soften the king's heart, she also made him confront the moral dilemmas of his own rule. Could he, a king who had ruled through fear and punishment, truly evolve into a monarch who ruled with compassion and wisdom? Shahrazad's psychological acumen allowed her to address not just the king's emotions, but his sense of duty as a ruler. She subtly wove into her narratives the themes of leadership, that a wise king must not simply wield power, but understand the fragility of human nature. She showed him that the true strength of a ruler did not lie in how harshly he punished, but in how he forgave and led his people to a better, more just future. Yet, despite Shahrazad's success in captivating his attention night after night, a looming question remained. Could she truly heal the king's soul? The scars of betrayal were deep, and though the king was beginning to open himself to the possibility of mercy, could he ever truly let go of the rage that had consumed him for so long? Would the king's grief prove too powerful for even the most profound stories to heal? Or would Shahrazad's strategy ultimately work, guiding him to a place of true redemption? Yet, despite her success in captivating his attention night after night, could Shahrazad truly heal the king's soul? Or would the scars of his betrayal prove too deep for even the most profound stories to heal?
For 3 years, King Shahryar ruled not with the grace of a monarch, but with the weight of grief and rage in his heart. His soul, ravaged by the betrayal of his first wife, had hardened into an unyielding force, and with each passing day, his belief in vengeance grew ever more entrenched. The world he inhabited was one in which betrayal and deceit were constant, and in his eyes, there was no place for mercy. Betrayal, to him, was a wound that could only be healed with death. Each woman who entered his bedchamber, each potential partner in his fragile world of trust, was, to him, a potential threat, a treacherous soul who could not be trusted. And so, he sentenced them all to death, believing that through this act of control he could protect himself from further hurt. His reasoning was brutal but logical in his mind. He had been betrayed by someone he loved, and thus it seemed only just to rid the world of those who could repeat the same act. This vicious cycle continued, each woman entering the king's chamber filled with hope, only to have that hope extinguished with the dawn. It was an existence ruled by fear, despair, and a cold certainty that there could be no other way forward. Then, into this world of darkness and retribution, came Shahrazad. Shahrazad was not just another woman sentenced to death. She was a daughter of wisdom, a woman of intellect, resilience, and most importantly, strategy. When she entered the royal chamber, she did not do so as a fearful victim, but as a storyteller with a deep understanding of human psychology. Her stories, ancient and complex, drew from the richness of Persian epics, Indian wisdom, and Mesopotamian myths, traditions that had long used narrative not just to entertain, but to shape lives and transform hearts. Shahrazad's mission was not merely survival, it was transformation. The transformation of a king's very soul, the healing of a heart ravaged by betrayal. Each night as she spun her stories, She was not simply passing time or keeping the king entertained. She was disrupting his entire worldview, challenging the assumptions that had built his empire of pain. Each tale, while beautifully crafted, was designed to unravel the rigid walls that Shahryar had erected around himself, walls built from fear and grief.
Her stories began with subtlety, leading him into worlds where kings ruled not with an iron fist, but with compassion. In tales of ancient Persian kings who ruled with mercy, and Indian sages whose wisdom transcended vengeance, Shahrazad introduced the king to a new paradigm of leadership. In these stories, the great rulers did not punish without understanding. They sought to heal the wounds of their people. These were not abstract ideas for Shahrazad. She understood the king's pain deeply, perhaps more than he understood himself, and through these tales she showed him a path to redemption, a path that was not fraught with vengeance, but with the courage to face one's own deepest fears and let them go. For the first time, King Shahryar began to understand that justice did not always mean retribution, and that mercy could be a force more powerful than punishment. Through stories of kings who overcame their own despair by choosing forgiveness, Shahrazad slowly began to peel back the layers of the king's grief, revealing a man who had once known love, compassion, and the possibility of healing. With each passing night, the king's transformation became more apparent. No longer was he the cold, calculating ruler who saw the world in terms of betrayal and revenge. Slowly, the seeds of empathy began to take root. The stories she told, carefully chosen, were not simply moral tales, but psychological interventions. They made Shahryar confront his own inner contradictions, his need for control, his yearning for love, and his inability to trust. In the story of the wise ruler who listens, Shahrazad showed the king that a leader who does not hear his people's pain is doomed to rule through fear and anger, never understanding the true nature of justice. In another tale, Shahrazad spoke of a ruler who forgave, even after the deepest betrayal, and in doing so, healed his kingdom from the very wounds that had caused its division. Each story was a mirror that reflected the king's own journey, from the pain of betrayal to the possibility of renewal.
But Shahrazad did not just tell stories to challenge the king's heart. She also confronted his deeply entrenched beliefs about power. Through the tales of leaders who ruled with wisdom rather than fear, who listened rather than judged, the king was given a new model of leadership, one based on the compassionate understanding of his people. Shahrazad showed him that true power did not come from control, but from the ability to lead with justice and mercy, to trust that those who had been hurt could be healed, and that even the most broken soul could find redemption. Yet despite this slow and careful unraveling of the king's hardened heart, the challenge was far from over. King Shahryar's transformation was not complete. Though he had begun to see that vengeance was not the only path to justice, his old wounds were still fresh, still raw. Could Shahrazad's storytelling continue to break through the barriers he had erected in the face of his trauma? Could the emotional scars of betrayal so deeply etched in his heart truly heal through mere words? The king's path to healing was far from guaranteed. Mercy and compassion had begun to take root, but the king's need for control, for a world where pain was answered with punishment, still lingered. Would the king, in the end, choose the path of forgiveness, or would his rage and need for dominance prove too powerful to overcome? Was Shahrazad's influence enough to undo the years of bitterness and sorrow that had shaped his reign? But as the king's transformation began to take shape, could the old, painful wounds of betrayal truly heal, or would his need for control and revenge rise again, threatening to undo all the progress Shahrazad had made?
The transformation that Shahrazad sought to bring about in King Shahryar was not one marked by sudden triumphs or dramatic shifts. It was slow, hesitant, much like the way a man who has been wounded learns to walk again, tentative at first, then more assured as the days pass. Each night, as Shahrazad spun her stories, she did not expect to heal him overnight. She understood that the pain of betrayal, so deeply embedded in the king's soul, would take time to heal. Her tales were not just an escape for the king, but a means to confront his darkest beliefs about justice and love. Each story she told was a small step in the arduous journey of redemption, one that did not promise immediate relief, but rather an unfolding understanding. The nature of leadership was at the heart of this transformation. In the days before Shahrazad's intervention, Shahryar had believed that justice was achieved through the swift application of power, through the control of those beneath him. His heart had become a fortress, impervious to compassion or mercy, for he had been betrayed by someone he had loved, and so he had decided that betrayal was an irreversible act, one that justified death in return. But in the space between her stories, Shahrazad gave him something that justice alone could not. She gave him wisdom. The wisdom that true leadership is not about wielding power in a cold, calculating manner, but about using compassion to understand the human condition. To lead, as she showed him through her tales, was to balance strength with vulnerability, and to make choices that were guided by mercy as much as by authority. With each passing night, Shahrazad did not simply entertain, she challenged the king's core beliefs. Through her carefully woven tales, she showed him that the nature of power is not about domination, but about restraint, not about being feared, but about being trusted. She introduced him to rulers of ancient Persia who led not with fear, but with understanding, leaders who had learned the strength of compassionate rule. These kings and queens who had chosen the path of mercy had brought peace to their people and had healed divisions that vengeance only deepened. As Shahryar listened, night after night, he began to feel the weight of the stories, not just as tales of far-off lands, but as a mirror reflecting his own decisions, his own desires. He began to wonder, could mercy truly be more powerful than revenge?
But the road to transformation was never linear. The king's internal struggle between vengeance and forgiveness was not an easy one. Shahryar's grief, the rawness of the betrayal he had suffered, was still fresh, still lurking beneath the surface. Each story Shahrazad told peeled back the layers of his grief, revealing not just the pain, but also the lingering hope that perhaps forgiveness could lead to a kind of healing that retribution never could. Yet even as these moments of revelation began to change him, the question remained, could a man who had been so deeply hurt ever truly change? Could he move from being a king who ruled by fear to a ruler who led by understanding? The challenge for Shahrazad was never just about changing the king's heart. It was about redefining what it meant to rule and what it meant to lead. She sought not just to save him, but to create a new model of governance, one that was rooted in mercy, compassion, and the understanding that justice was not simply about punishment, but about restoration. And so, Shahrazad's influence began to take shape, not in grand proclamations or sweeping gestures, but in the quiet revolution of the king's heart. Slowly, Shahryar began to see the world differently. His prison of vengeance began to crumble, piece by piece, as he listened to tales of rulers who chose mercy over death, of men and women who found strength not in their ability to control, but in their willingness to trust. Shahrazad's stories had planted the seeds of a new kind of leadership, one that did not require domination or fear, but one that relied on empathy and understanding. But would those seeds grow into something real, or would they be smothered beneath the weight of the king's old wounds?
As the transformation unfolded, Shahrazad understood that her task was never complete. True leadership, she had learned, was not about having the final word, but about continued growth, the ongoing process of questioning, evolving, and embracing humility. She had begun the process, but whether the king would continue it was yet to be seen. The power of stories lay in their ability to question, to reshape narratives, and to offer alternative paths. But could the king's heart, so long hardened by betrayal, truly find peace? And could his reign, forged in the flames of vengeance, ever be reborn into something that embraced the mercy Shahrazad had so carefully cultivated? The legacy of her tales, like the stories themselves, was left hanging in the air, unresolved, waiting to see if a king so steeped in loss and rage could ever fully embrace the possibility of redemption. Would King Shahryar be able to let go of the ghosts of his past, or would the very scars of betrayal become the chains that would bind him to a past of fear and retribution? As the king's transformation began to take shape, could the old, painful wounds of betrayal truly heal? Or would his need for control and revenge rise again, threatening to undo all the progress Shahrazad had made? As you followed the journey of Shahrazad and King Shahryar, you've witnessed the transformative power of stories, not just to entertain, but to heal, challenge, and change the very heart of a ruler. But the question remains, can true redemption be achieved, or is the past too deeply etched to heal? If Shahrazad's stories have left you questioning the nature of justice, mercy, and leadership, then we want to hear from you. What do you believe? Can a person who has been scarred by betrayal ever truly change, or are we doomed to repeat the patterns of our past? Comment below and share your thoughts. What is the power of storytelling in your life? How do you think stories shape our understanding of right and wrong, of love and vengeance? And if you've been captivated by Shahrazad's wisdom, the king's transformation, and the power of narrative to reshape destinies, don't forget to subscribe. Join us as we continue exploring the timeless power of storytelling to heal, transform, and challenge our world, one story at a time.